matters, the term also conveys the general meaning of being concerned with the affairs of the world, of being not sacred, not monastic, not
ecclesiastical,
ecclesiastical, of being something temporal, something profane. Hence, we find this term being translated by Christian Arabs into Christian Arabic as Almaniya, meaning ليس من أبواب الفن أو الحرفة, and secularity as الاهتمام بأمور الدنيا or الاهتمام بالعاميات, and to secularize as حول إلى غرض العالمية أي دنيوية أي دنيوي. This translation of the term and its various grammatical forms in the sense understood by the Western Christian Church and its Christian Arab translators has been allowed to gain currency in contemporary mainstream Islamic Arabic despite the clear fact that it has no relevance whatsoever to Islam and to the Muslim Ummah. There is no equivalent in Islam to the concept of secular, especially when there is no equivalent to church or clergy, and when Islam does not concede that there is a dichotomy of the sacred and the profane, which naturally brings about a demeaning of the profane world. If the nearest equivalent were to be found in Islam to the concept secular, then it would be that which is connoted by the Quranic concept of al-hayatu dunya, the worldly life. The word dunya, derived from dana, conveys the meaning of something being brought near. This something that is being brought near, according to my interpretation, is the world together with all its parts. For it is the world that is being brought near, that is being brought near to the experience and consciousness of man. Hence, the world called dunya, by virtue of the fact that what is being brought near, that is the world and the life in it, surround us as it were and overwhelm us. We are bound to distract from consciousness and our final destination, which is beyond this world and this life, which is what comes after, that is al-akhirah. Since it comes at the end, al-akhirah is felt as far, and this accentuates the distraction created by what is near. The Holy Quran says that the hereafter is better than the life of this world. It is more abiding, everlasting. But the Holy Quran does not derogate the world itself or dissuade from contemplation and reflection and interpretation of it and its wonders. Rather, it extols the world of creation and urges to contemplate and reflect upon it and its wonders in order that we might be able to interpret and derive their practical and beneficial purpose. The Holy Quran only warns of the distracting and ephemeral nature of life in the world. The warning emphasis in the concept of al-hayat dunya is life in it, not the world, so that the world and nature are not demeaned as implied in the concept secular. That is why I said that al-hayat dunya is the nearest equivalent to the concept secular, because in actual fact there is no real equivalent concept in the worldview of Islam projected by the Holy Quran. Moreover, since the world is that which is brought near, and since the world and nature are signs or ayat of God, it is the signs of God that are brought near to our experience and consciousness. And it would be blasphemous, to say the least, to derogate the world and nature, knowing them in their true characteristics. It is God's manifestation of His infinite mercy and loving kindness that He caused His signs to be brought near to us, the better for us to understand their intended meaning. There can be no excuse, therefore, for those who, struck by awe of the signs, worship them instead of God to whom they point. Or those who, seeking God, yet demean and abjure His signs because they see tempting evil in them and not in themselves. Or again, those who, denying God, appropriate His signs for their own materialistic ends and change Him in pursuit of illusory development. The world cannot develop as it is already perfect according to its own fitrah. Only life in the world can develop. There is a final end to the world just as there is a final end to life in the world. Development of life in the world is that which leads to success in that which comes after it. For there is no meaning to development unless it is aligned to a final objective.
So, Alhamdulillah, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We resume our reading of Professor Sayyid Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas's Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of Islam. And we have now reached page 20. In the first paragraph, Professor Attas begins with a note on language. He mentions that language reflects ontology. Now, that alone is a very powerful thesis statement. Language reflects ontology would mean that ontology is a reflection of language. And by ontology is meant what we consider to be ultimately true and real. To possess ontic status would mean to possess existential status. So therefore, your usage of language is a reflection of your ultimate worldview and reality. And now, if we let that sink in for a while, languages consists of vocabularies, but not all vocabulary consists of vocabulary of words. But not all words are of equal standing, as you would find, say, in a dictionary. A dictionary is not a really helpful guide to understand the ontology of a culture, because a dictionary which is organized, say, on the alphabetical principle cannot distinguish, say, between soap and Saturn and sun, yes, and sunlight. All these things would be grouped under one letter, but they all have different status in reality. Or, the entry on God and government and goods would all be filed under G, but that doesn't say anything about the relative places in the worldview. However, when we speak about language reflecting ontology, we must mean the most important concepts that reflect the reality, which is why then he said introducing key concepts foreign to a language involves not merely the translating of words, but more profoundly the translating of symbolic forms belonging to the supersystem of a foreign worldview, not compatible with the worldview projected by the language into which such concepts are introduced. And we know this, that the Quran, upon its introduction to humanity, gives changes to the ontology of those who are its direct recipients, yani humanity. So you will find not just the Quran, but by extension the Prophet and his speech, yes, that they would involve themselves, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet in his speech, that you would find central key terms undergoing changes, amongst which would include the notion of karam. Yes, that's one particular example that is profound, because the notion karam is a key term with regards to ethics of how one should lead one's life. It is in axiology, in our theory of value, a person of nobility is to be valued. So therefore, whereas previously the notion of karam was organized on the principle of the hierarchy of wealth, lineage, and power, the Quran reorganizes the notion of karam such that its nobility is tied with the notion of taqwa. So that changes the internal content. The Prophet does that as he also introduces the notion of who is the courageous person, when it is said that the courageous person is the one who is most capable of controlling his anger. And he does that in a number of instances. And the Quran does that with regards to the world also. We know that some concepts are new to the Arabs who first heard the Quran. The Quran mentions, for example, a new concept such as al-haqqa or al-qari'ah. Then the method is to, after having introduced this concept, to ask them what is the meaning of this concept and what do they know regarding this concept. And then the Quran explains the internal content of that concept. And this then shapes the worldview of the recipients of the Quran. So wherever Islam has traveled, these central key terms would travel together with it. And whenever Islam is translated into a foreign language, the central vocabulary would likewise either be translated or would have been introduced such that it would carry the same connotation. So we have in this, as Professor Attas would then explain in the coming pages, his conception of an Islamic language is that languages such as Urdu, Malay, Persian, Ottoman Turkish, and several others that have received the effect of the Islamization process, you would find certain key terms that is directly from the Arabic of the Quran, like words such as ilm, alam, Allah. Several of these would be found throughout the languages, since these are key terms, and they carry the same connotation as it did in the original language of the Islamized Arabic. So now Professor Attas is saying then that secularization is a concept that is being introduced, or its cognates: secularization, secularism, secularizationism, the secular, all these words that is related to the secular. If you were to translate it into Arabic or into an Islamic language without pointing to its foreign origins, would introduce confusion in the mind and the intellect of the Muslims. Yes. So then he went on to trace the origins of this concept of secular. Yes, it is of Latin origin, the concept, the seculum. Certainly, it is not the Greeks who introduced the notion of the secular, because the Greeks in themselves, their worldview was not derived from revelation, but it was derived from religion/mythology, out of which the philosophical process acted upon it. Yes, but as for the origins in the Latin West, yes, the notion of the seculum, as he gives by its brief history, was introduced by the Church. And we know that the Church, the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, introduced itself in history as a system of a hierarchy. It gradually mirrored itself after the Roman Empire, and then and after having organized themselves into a graded priestly organization, they then understood the potential at their hands, and thereby, since they are, since they have developed themselves into a universal religion, with, let us say, with the activity of mission work, they then understood that some priests, yes, are to, those amongst the priests who concern themselves with religious and sacred matters. These are the ecclesiastical priests. And then there are the laity, yes, what they call the laymen. These are the secular priests. So the secular priests are the ones who are involved in worldly matters. They involve themselves in trade, and they involve themselves in basically profane matters. So at the same time also, where thought or philosophy is concerned, we know that some of the founding fathers of amongst the thinkers of Western Christianity, like Augustine, he had a previous background of Manichaeanism, the notion of a dualistic world, the dualistic world. Yes, and this dualistic world is, between darkness and light, like that. So he brought with it this categorization into Christianity, such that you had a very strong opposition between the realm of the sacred and the profane. Augustine was in the 4th century. Dualism, if it was included in Christianity before that, did not involve the demeaning of nature. Yes, because the earliest background to Christianity you would find, say in the immediate, say the first 3 centuries, you would find that already in the introduction of Christianity within the Greek and Hellenistic speaking people, you would already have the baggage of Greek theology that would have introduced some of these elements. Greek theology, yes, philosophical theology, because by then in the Hellenistic world, it was what you call the post-Aristotelian period. And so you would find that in order to explain itself, Christianity had to choose from the vocabulary that was available. Was it a religion? Was it a faith? Did it possess a theology? And since they chose to express themselves mainly through theology, then the terminologies governing their theological system would derive from Greek metaphysics and epistemology, that vocabulary. Unlike the case with Islam, the most extant texts of the Bible, meaning the earliest manuscripts of the Bible, were all composed and written in Greek. None of them were written in the original language of a Semitic prophet like Prophet Isa alayhi salam. To be just, there are amongst even later thinkers that try to contend that perhaps the original revelation was in that language, in the Greek language. Some of them did say, although it's very difficult to defend that thesis, but they have gone down that route. Nevertheless, the notion of demeaning of nature became inherent in the post-Augustinian theology. So you find, therefore, that you have the realm of the sacred, and then this realm is the realm of the profane. And also the Augustinian impact was also at the same time to remove interest in the study of nature. It took several centuries after, yes, via the Muslim translation movement, from Greek to Arabic and from Arabic to Latin, before the impetus to study nature became returned towards Christianity. But in the Augustinian period, until about the 11th or 12th centuries, you would find that the study of nature was considered the study of the profane. Well, that you ought to be involving yourself into sacred contemplation. And even with regards to their notion of the intellect, they had 2 terms to describe a human being's thinking principle. One was called ratio, and the other was called intellectus. Ratio is that ratiocinative principle that involves itself in, say, quantitative reasoning, involves itself in logical sequencing. And then the other aspect, which is called the intellectus, is involved in more of the sort of aesthetic experience, spiritual contemplation, like that. And they divorce this. So that's another source of the dualism. So there's the dualism of the sacred and the profane, and then there's the dualism of the ratio and the intellectus. So these are some of the initial steps that led to the full force of the process of secularization. To be sure, or to be clear, when we speak about secularism, yes, what do we mean by this? So we have this thing called the saeculum. The saeculum literally refers to the here and now. Yes, to the here and now, meaning to say it has a spatial and temporal connotation. The spatial connotation refers to the fact that you are primarily concerned with this world, and the temporal connotation refers specifically that you are involving yourself with the present state of history. And when you are concerned with the saeculum, that would mean you're not concerned about the sacred matters, you're not concerned about the ecclesiastical matters, you're not concerned about the spiritual matters. And you see how then how this concept could potentially develop to a full-fledged secularism, whereby it would cause in history the removal of any religious influence upon society. Yes, that's why eventually when we study this term secularism, yes, you will find that there are several connotations by the end of the 19th century. One meaning of secularization or secularism is the dominant one, which is usually promoted in Muslim countries when it is being translated, is the fact that secularism means to divorce between religion and politics. That's the dominant understanding, because that's the easiest to detect. The fact that religion no longer has a say in determining the programs and the projects of the secular state. It is the creation of secular spaces. The idea of a secular space makes a religion becomes privatized. Yes, so the notion or the existence of a secular space privatizes religion until religion becomes a matter of conscience, and a religion becomes a matter of private practice. As for the public sphere, it becomes a secular sphere, in which religion has no say to determine the values and the notion of reality of the people. Supposing then one were to ask, what is the mark of a secular society? Well, then some of the secular theorists will say possibly the very well respected distinction between law and morality. Morality may be religiously sourced, yes, but law is secularly determined. So your conscience will, yes, the line or the distinction drawn between law and morality. So whereas morality can be drawn from religion, personal philosophy, whatever that you like to determine your morality. But where law is concerned, it is to be determined by the secular sphere, based on secular principles, because that's how the logic of justice has developed in Western Christendom. A second feature related to the distinction between law and morality is the respect of private human conscience. The idea that an individual is free to choose whatever his belief system, and the state has no say in whatever the religion the individual decides. So this is a double-edged sword in that sense. So supposing now we understand a few things about secularism, what then is the secularization thesis? Yes. So the Enlightenment scholars and philosophers, they consider that the secularization thesis consists of several things. One of which is that with modernity, yes, modernity is or the natural consequence of modernization is secularization. That's one thesis that they thought, that as societies progress with scientific knowledge, as societies begin to become functionally differentiated based on rational principles, you will detect decline in religious practices. That's one thesis. The second thesis is the functional differentiation of society would lead to secular spaces. And these secular spaces are independent of religious evaluation. What are some of the consequences? Well, first, it is the strongest of them is the secular state. The idea that the secular state is a sovereign entity, and this is a purely modern invention. Whereas we know that in previous societies there is sovereignty has always come from without human beings. You can have very powerful lords and kings, but they have always had to rely on a notion of some metaphysical source of their power. Yes, they may be abusive of that power, but overall, as a system, yes, secularity is this idea that the state has no governing principle over and above itself, and the state has and to determine sovereignty within the state, is to ask who has the power to grant the state of exception. Yes, you have, if this is according to Carl Schmitt, the notion that things are usually in order in society. And when things are usually in order in society, every individual enjoys to a certain degree their privileges and rights. Yes, but wait till a crisis comes. If a crisis comes, then the one who is truly sovereign in that society will be able to declare a state of exception, and they can encroach upon whatever initial rights and and privileges that you thought you had. Yes, and now I mean and so those who have studied political thought properly will then think, or rather amongst the rulers who wish to hold power in their hands within the secular age that we live today, all that they need is to invent, yes, or to welcome a crisis in order to declare their sovereignty. Yes, because the state has become now the highest sovereign, and that which is sovereign of the sovereign state, the deep state, shall we say, is the one with the capacity to declare the state of emergency or the state of exception. So that's one functionary of the secularism. So as we said just now, the functional differentiation also gave birth to the modern capitalist market. Yes, I think Harvey Cox, who initially wrote The Secular City, his best-selling book, the basic premise of The Secular City is the first thesis, yes, basically that society, with their gradual discoveries in philosophy and science and thought, have understood that the world is secular in reality. Therefore, the movement of society is towards secularization. Then, thirdly, the church, therefore, will only maintain its function in society insofar as it supports the secular narrative. So that's Harvey Cox's earlier work. His more recent work is the notion of the market as God. Meaning to say, it's another way of putting the market as a secular space also. So that there is this, within the market, you do not have any religious control. There is no, in contrast to the early generations of Muslims, you have Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab, who said, for example, that a person who wishes to trade in the souk must be a person who have understood the religion. So it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately who is the giver he is the source of sovereignty, and he is the one who grants the permission to trade in amongst mankind, and he commands justice like that. And thirdly, so we have the state, the market, and thirdly, science. Yes, science has also been packaged within the functionally differentiated society as a fully secular enterprise. The idea of a fully secular enterprise means that they do not observe any normative limits and restrictions on their practices. Certainly not from religion. Yes, they may think that their conscience is the one that determines their scientific projects, but based on their track record in the past 200 years, yes, without the axiological and normative constraints of religion, where have they taken it? Yes, what sort of technologies have they developed, and what sort of scientific projects have been funded? So these three domains, yes, are the functionally differentiated domains. Yes, when you say a differentiation based on their functions, based on the secular logic. So if these are the manifestation, if these three are the effects of secularization, what's the root of all these three? The root of all these three is is the third thesis, secularization as a philosophical program. That's the root of the effects. Yes, the decline of religion and the creation of the public spaces in the market, in the university, and other places of scientific research, and in the political seats. So what then is secularization as a philosophical program? Well, then Professor Atas quotes I think the Dutch theologian who mentions that basically it consists of three elements. First and foremost is the disenchantment of nature. The idea of a disenchantment of nature is to empty nature of any spiritual connotation. And in other words, it is to begin with the world. So that's why Professor Atas is talking about the hayat dunya, to begin with the dunya and to remove of it any spiritual connotation. Yes, the frog is a frog. Yes, the tree is a tree, and the woods are the woods. They don't reflect any metaphysical origins. They are not the creation of an all-powerful, all-merciful Lord. They are just there, and we are just here, and we happen to know because we are accidents of the evolutionary process. The world happens to be because it happens to be. All these sort of things. So that logic of the disenchantment of nature, the emptying from nature of any spiritual contents, is the let us say the philosophical position that have been argued for, campaigned for, struggled for during the Enlightenment period and slightly before. So we will find that the effects of disenchantment of nature would trickle onto society, because if you disenchant nature, which includes the existence of God, the consequence would be the second part, which is the desacralization of politics.
Can I ask questions
Yeah.
now?
Okay, if it's
Because it's interesting, because if these are the outcomes of secularization, because these are very Christian concepts, I think, the disenchantment of nature, that was an outcome of the war on paganism.
Yes.
So that's very Christian.
The desacralization of politics is the second one.
No, but also with nature, it's also very Christian, because it comes from the concept of stewardship in the Bible, that man must be master of nature, and nature is not, there's no sanctity.
Yes.
So it's just interesting to see.
Yes, you're right. Professor Atas does mention that the roots of secularization ultimately derives from Christianity. Why is it made to feel as if it is a universal phenomena? Is only by the unnatural means of colonization and the spread of Western epistemology in the universities, concurrent with remember these three institutions, the market, the state, and the university, working in tandem, that since it was coupled with the project of colonization, wherever it went, they brought with it structural genocide in order to propagate their system. So structural genocide would mean, if you come into a Muslim nation, it would include the destruction of the awqaf, which would sustain the madrasa, which would then have impacts on the Muslim state, or rather the khilafah, or if it's a sultanate, then it is a sultanate. So basically, it came together with that. And since colonization was very effective with the bayonets and the other weapons and the means of structural genocide, it is presented and portrayed as a universal project. But in truth, the origins of secularization derive from their own internal logic of Christianity, and even that choice was a historically determined choice in that sense. Why is it that they chose to demean nature in the first place? Why did they consider the realm of the present here and now as the source of evil, that nature is to be looked at as a thing? Well, this is explained because when Christianity came onto the fore, precisely because of the weakness in their own, say, narration, in their own reporting from their prophet, it made them unable to confront the relatively developed natural theology of the Greeks. So since they were unable to confront the natural theology of the Greeks, they therefore chose to demean nature, and instead focus people to the study of their Bible. Whereas if you look at the differing faiths between Islam and Christianity, when Islam came upon the data of rather well-developed natural philosophy, our scholars were able to develop an alternative world picture that could better explain the phenomena than the Greeks. But none such examples existed in Christianity except after their receiving benefit from Islam. So you would find that Augustine did not provide an alternative natural theology to Aristotle. He didn't provide nor the desert fathers before him. All these thinkers, they shied away from actually confronting the massive body of natural philosophy, and instead chose to demean. But in Islam, when we encountered the natural philosophers, within a rather short span of time, in all the disciplines, there was basically either a continuation or development, or where required a revolution. Now, to return to the internal components of secularization, therefore, you have from the disenchantment of nature. I mean, the violent disenchantment of nature, to the extent that even it removed God away from their consciousness, happened post Aquinas and post absorption of Aristotelianism into Christianity, to such an extent that, because we see that with the Thomistic, what he calls the Thomistic synthesis, you find that the universities tried to develop further and further the natural sciences, and this time it was the sacred that became the victim. They developed the profane aspects, and so the secular became their focus, until eventually it removed any need for the spiritual source of reality. Now, this disenchantment of nature produced the desacralization of politics, and also at the same time what we call the deconsecration of values. So no values are considered consecrated anymore. To consecrate a value would mean to consider it sacred. A value that is consecrated is because it possesses a sacred origin in religion or in spirituality. But to deconsecrate values would be to declare that all values are humanly motivated. And you find this in 19th and 18th century Western thinkers, you like the likes of Nietzsche, and before that Kant. They will say that, well, morality is about a struggle of power. Yes, either you are the Superman class, or you're the class of the herd. And based on your position in society, that's the morality that you would profess. That's already a deconsecrated form of morality, a transvaluation of values. And politics, likewise, became a profane activity. So now that we know roughly the pedigree or the DNA of secularization as a philosophical program, introducing such a concept into the Muslim languages and into the Muslim nations would only create confusion, because it would carry with it the vocabularies that is involved in such things. And as we said just now with regards to structural genocide, yes, or rather, yes, the destruction of the structural systems of the Muslims, we find, subhanallah, yes, as the Prophet said in one of the hadith, that the first thing to go away is the governance structure. So the fall or the collapse of the governance structure has made the Muslim nations, for the past 100 or 120 or more or so years, struggling with the new reality, with the new symbolic reality of secularism, with its specific vocabularies in morality, in the legal sphere, in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, in all the spheres of values. It has been controlled by the secular institutions and the secular conceptions. So Professor Atas is now saying that, well, first and foremost, since language reflects ontology, your first step, your first task of liberating your intellect would be to liberate your language. To liberate your language via the liberation of the concepts. So Inshallah, that's the extent that we wish to share. Let us hear the. Mm-hmm.
No, you can't. It's a cliffhanger. You can't stop.
No, that's where the reflections and the question rounds will bring out the things that needs to come up, inshallah. I suppose you have the first round.
No, I mean, it was just maybe not a question, maybe an observation. It's just the fact that Christianity tried to kind of, kill non-Christian elements in society, and it ended up being kind of completely pushed away by these very elements that tried to suppress. But I don't think Islam did the same, right? Islam was not exclusive. It was very inclusive in all the societies introduced into, whether it's Asia, Far East, Africa. So it's an observation that I think that continues to prove that Islam still possesses like true revelation. It possesses light that actually descended from the heavens, from God, and that is the reason why it continues to be relevant in every society, in every culture, in every age as well. So it's transcultural and trans. That is the term. Yes, it's just a observation.
And what is even more strange, I suppose, is that the Muslims have been made to grow accustomed to the secular systems, and of course, certainly they have their courage been taken away from them. They suffer what is called the historical parochialism, meaning they are stuck on the here and now. To use the pun from secularism, they're stuck in the secular here and now to such an extent that they become ineffective, and they play the roles that has been assigned to them. One of the things that I was just thinking when reading these pages, and the other references with regards to secularization. Supposing we ask, is there anyone? Yes. What is preventing Muslims from healthily entering into the universe of discourse, yes, and providing their alternative vision of society with regards to how first with regards to science? Why isn't it that the Muslims are not at the forefront of challenging the scientific research program and influencing society towards what sort of scientific projects that are truly of benefit, yes? And then with regards to market capitalism also, since we possess a rich literature and tradition as to how the market can be can be a place of justice as opposition, is why is it that the Muslims are not at the forefront, say, of providing a critique of moral injustices in trade, but instead they produce semi or rather half-baked responses to such an extent that you accept whatever principles of capitalism anyways, but you give them Islamic names. But in truth, you should be dealing at the heart of the problem, isn't it? With injustice, with fair trade, and so on. And thirdly, with regards to the state, they are the Muslims are the one who possess the sources of normative restraint that could really lead to a good society. But they are not providing the vocabularies of justice in the public domain. And certainly the aim is not just to enrich public discourse, but it is to actually, that's the meaning of stewardship, to bring society towards a closer, closer in terms of its parameter to the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Where is the ta'awun? The mutual assistance amongst the Muslims. But instead, the Muslims have taken the role that has been given by secularization, Because in the West, we understand why they became so suspect of religion, that the only place for religion in society is in the individual, in the privatized sphere. They have tried to push religion like that in the privatized sphere, but Cox was wrong, and the secular predictions, as they predicted, didn't happen. The secularization thesis has been empirically verified, falsified. It is simply not the case that the more modernized you become, the more secular you become. That's not a given, because where the most advanced economies are concerned, um, you know, the people have grown conscious. The people have gone back to religion, and so rather than saying that modernity necessitates secularity, you would say that actually you should be that there are multiple modernities, and some of these modernities would be in line with religious principles if the religious principles are in possession. I mean, the people defending religion, representing religion, possess the courage, the creativity, and the temperance to do so. Instead, we have we have Muslims who have followed the track of the the Christian structures, whereby they have, in a sense, they have given up on trying to stop the waves of secularization.
When Harvey Cox,
I think he wrote it in 1969, in the 1960s. Yeah.
perhaps just before the spiritual revolution. I don't
Yes.
missed out on the obvious statement
Exactly.
by very materially Western societies that outright to spirituality religion.
Yeah, and he didn't see what was happening with Iran, what was happening with the rest of the Muslim world. He didn't see what was happening even with the rise of the born again Christians and evangelists. So that thesis has been exploded basically.
But I wanted to also say, perhaps like the reason why the Muslims have gone back. I mean, there are these elements that are necessary, like courage and such, but also you have to consider perhaps the world order, right? The Millennium Project, how it
Yes.
destroyed Muslim societies.
Yeah.
And since then, they haven't really been able to reestablish the model that they have lived in and through for hundreds of years. So I think it's perhaps more of a realist view, but you have to consider that Muslim societies were intentionally destroyed. I mean, I'm from Egypt, and in the Egyptian experience, we had two main colonial waves. First, it was the French, and then it was English. Al-Murtada Zabidi, famous literary scholar from Yemen, who wrote Taj al-Arus, famous work in the Muslims dictionary, perhaps. So in his diary, he wrote that the French used to kill 5 Azhari scholars every day. 5 scholars every day, like they would target like specific scholars, especially in language, to the extent that the connected chain of transmission, the Senate and some sciences were completely disrupted. Like they've actually interrupted the Senate. Like, so, I mean, that's not a coincidence, right?
Definitely.
So I mean, there was these like targeted plans to really destroy Muslim societies and the social institutions, that developed over hundreds of years. And if you destroy those, you do not rebuild them in some years and establish yourself. So that was the French. They really targeted knowledge, science, and culture. And then the English came and they destroyed the Egyptian economy. So the Egyptian economy was thriving on small and now they call it small and medium enterprises, right? So they came and completely destroyed that. Like they literally destroyed it and then transformed Egypt into basically a colony state system that just supplies raw material to the empire.
Yes.
So I mean, if you go through something like that within 50 years or 50 years later, when you get independence, you do not expect that this type of society is going to rise all of a sudden, right? And
Yes.
kind of be able to comment and critique and etc. So, I mean, the problem is, it's complicated.
Yes, and I don't disagree with you. We know Taha Abdul Rahman, he wrote, I think, one of the most powerful critiques of modernity. Wael Halak has done a study on him called Reforming Modernity, in which basically he understood that the task of the present-day Muslims is to bring and to flesh out the principles of the religion pertaining to ethics, morality, basically to the source of normative constraints, which is, the fact is secularization, since it has reduced everything to the evaluation of man, knows no such constraints. And that's the source of most of the destruction, including the destruction of man, of his environment, and the climate crisis, and the mutual destruction. So what Taha Abdul Rahman's work focuses on is to bring out such ethical principles derived from revelation and Surah, in order to I mean, and the allies that he's looking for is not necessarily from coming, not just from the Muslim nations who are now just surviving the colonial onslaught, but also, the potential allies must come from within the Western thought, from the Western universe. In other words, the interesting pattern that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has determined for natural history of the world includes the fact that, well, a great sea of migration came from the Muslim worlds to the Western worlds. Whether or not they carry with them their Torah is one matter, but at the very least, if they carry within them the seeds of Islam, if they possess the right thinking mechanism, then they can rebuild and critique the aspects of society. So certainly, perhaps in some of the countries that has been drained dry, including, of course, the Indian subcontinent and other parts of the world that has been turned into providers of raw material for the material development of Western Europe. Well, they might find a lot. They might require some time to recover, especially with the destruction of the structures. But what is still a possibility is the change of the discourse to such an extent that such institutions can exist and can develop within the Western world, in the hopes that they can tame to a certain extent this modernity. What do you think of this one? Yeah, of course.
Yes, I thought about the earlier language technology. Language in reality is maintained expression of a system. But this basically criticizing this idea of that when it comes to science, they have a tendency to take specific practices and make it seem like. So I had this conversation with some about Hijama. Hijama for me is the idea of an abstract God. This obviously, works. It's very verifiable. But he was arguing that, and I asked him, what do you think is happening? He said, no, they're removing energy, the change of energy. Right? Maybe I'm just ignorant on the subject, but I've never read that interpretation before. So, and that brings up the contention of when you have two different systems of reality and you have to engage, you can't not engage, because that's a good way to protect your ideas. But when you engage, you corrupt them. So how do you engage with different system of reality that will not? You see this in other examples as well. Jihad is an example where it's been turned into a reflection of the Catholic just war tradition. That's how we now present it. But that's not in its original form. But we don't know how to engage with it, and the system is so vast. So how do you engage with the different system of reality?
First, by knowing what are the central key terms of your reality, and what concepts are considered. There is a term that in the economics discipline, whether they are convertible or not within one system and another system. Some concepts, for example, are secular and mundane to such an extent that in all worldviews they're just the same. A soap is a soap, like that. But as soon as we enter into more contentious fields, including, as you described just now, medical practice. Now, medical practice carries with it certain cognitive framework, including, there are medical systems that are based on a theory of anatomy, and there are others that is based on energy and so on and so forth. Well, one of the key features of the Islamic intellectual tradition is its ability to engage with external, because it derives from revelation, and it accords respect to the mental equipment that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has given mankind, to such an extent that you find, in the Maturidi theological tracts, an ability to confront, non-Muslims, including, say, the sophists and the Christians and the philosophers, because they say, well, we affirm that reason and the five senses, as well as through reports, these are valid channels of knowledge. And then, of course, once you affirm that these three are valid channels of knowledge, then you have to argue the next step. These are our methods of arriving at truth based on these individual channels, and so on and so forth. And certainly there will be an element of theory building also, and verification of the theories that you built. But all in all, there is what you may call a scientific conceptual scheme, yes, which makes, therefore, not just one ontological scheme, another ontological scheme, as if to say that you can freely acquire any one. The disagreements between the heliocentrists and the geocentrists in astronomy is not just a mere function of worldview. It's a matter where factual a factual test is relevant to determine which one is true or false. Yes, and then you have this in Thomas Kuhn. He has a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he studies about how big theories usually will have supporting sub theories, and they will continue to be subscribed by the scientific community even as anomalies begin to appear. And usually, with the appearance of anomalies, what they will do is to use ad hominem sort of defenses, because there is no alternative major theory. Until an alternative major theory that can support the variety of facts emerges to replace that one, then it becomes a scientific revolution. So in the medical sciences, it is also like that. Yes. So the Islamic intellectual tradition have at the different points of history taken on different conceptions of medical practice and healing and so on. And so now you're faced with modern medical practices with the dominant paradigm of testing and symptoms, and the removal of symptoms and diagnosis and so on and so forth. So what is necessary for our time, and of course this harkens back to the realists in the room also, the discussion of whether or not we have the resources to do that, because and whether it is a priority. But one of the things that if we do have the resources to do would be to build an Islamic university in which we study within of course we would be guided by the Fardu Ain and the Fardhu Kifaya principle. And the Fardhu Kifaya will determine, the priority of the orders of the sciences that needs to be Islamized, and to what extent that they need to be Islamized. And in order for that process to happen, it cannot be some sort of simple process. It has to involve, the study of the history of the science, the philosophy of the particular science. And if we're talking about medicine, a number of things which are relevant to the discussion is at stake. So that is how you can fruitfully enter into the discussion. Yes, and the Muslims in the past, they have not shied away from such discussions when they had the ability to do so. That's why they had. Imam Al-Ghazali did an analysis on astrology and astronomy, which had the unfortunate fate of having only one name for two different aspects. Yes, only later on, yes, they distinguish between astrology and astronomy. But in Imam Al-Ghazali's writing in the Book of Knowledge, he was criticizing astronomy, which is really astrology, and saying that astronomy is fine. Yes, but these are the sort of critiques that our scholars were involved in themselves in. Yes, that led to the birth of what is probably a science and what is a pseudo science like that. And so that's why where Muslims are concerned, it doesn't mean that just because something is in our heritage that we have to defend that also. What the defend what we choose to defend must be based on strong principles.
I think like Islam, as we were discussing earlier, is quite, it's not exclusive, it's very inclusive, and it's really, it doesn't have a problem to adopt any like knowledge systems.
Yeah.
It's used as a vessel. I mean, it's not concerned with the vessel as more of the content.
Yeah.
So we see that, like you said, even in astrology, like it adopted because Arabs were magnificent astrologers. It adopted the pagan astrological systems.
Yeah.
Also in medicine, in Islamic medicine, we adopted 4 elements,
yeah.
Which were used by Indians, such and such. I mean, they didn't have to to find exclusive science that called Islamic.
Yeah.
But rather it utilizes the concepts, perhaps creates axiological frameworks for these concepts, but it doesn't have to necessarily be Islamic in that sense.
And likewise can be said of the cosmological doctrines. They did adopt some of the pagan sort of beliefs, but that's the thing about the scientific enterprise. Because the Islamic civilization deriving from the Quran, a very powerful epistemic, ethical, axiological principle and metaphysical principle, allows it to find that when there's sufficient amount of anomalies and there's problems of it, because they possess the scientific conceptual scheme, they possess the notion of method, they possess the notion of truth, and so on and so forth, they would be able to perform the internal critiques if they have the community of scholars and they have the existence of a knowledge culture that can be properly done.
Yeah, I think lots of knowledge into this tradition is like Sheikh also said that to be able to do that, you need to have a very deep knowledge of the system that's from. And if you don't have that, that's when it's surprising. That was a contention that
Our guests, anything to share today?
Because most people's understanding is really
Yeah, and it's been an unfortunate, let us say, unfortunate collateral that since Islamization is freely used by those responsible and those who are not responsible, it has been used to label even the most pettiest of things. But the idea of Islamization as conceived by Professor Naqib Alatas is something very profound, because secular Islamization of knowledge is our answer to the problem of secularism, i.e. that that Islamization is the liberation of the mind, yes, from mythological, animistic, secular, national control of one's reason and language. Yes, so it is the liberation from all that control against our language, so as to return to the reality of truth, like that. Yes, the ontological scheme, the metaphysical scheme, the epistemic scheme, and the axiological scheme of the religion. So that's the proper process of Islamization. But on top of this, there has been, irresponsible agents who are spreading a cut-out version of that and saying that, well, Islamization is merely, to put an Islamic verse upon something and a label. It's like grafting in that sense. You graft a system which is not properly Islamic, but since you put in a few verses that are there, and it becomes Islamic. Or by putting things out of context, like whereas proper Islamization of an institution would involve the things that I say just now. So instead, you do a sort of halfway sort of thing, where you say, well, our institution as an Islamic institution, because all the individuals in this institution are given the ability to pray 5 times, and at the end of the year, we give them some money for Umrah, and they also have the ability to put on their hijab, and so on and so forth. So it looks like, so therefore it is an Islamic institution. But supposing we ask, what is the nature of your institution? Well, we deal with riba primarily. How can that be Islamic? So that's not properly Islamization. Proper, but for the general public, the unknowing public, that could pass as an Islamization exercise, as they say, or segregation of, yes, yes. So yes,
I was actually a victim of that because I graduated from an Islamic school.
Okay.
From kindergarten all the way to high school. And the reason why it was called Islamic because girls would put on the hijab, and we only hired Muslim teachers. That's about it. I mean, all the curriculums are secular.
That's another a very excellent example. Yeah.